When the world gets better, let's build a better world.
Of better values and choices.
With cleaner homes, cleaner energy, cleaner coastlines. With better products from better materials.
Using less, but giving more.
When the world gets better, let's just get better and better. Miele, immer besser.
Welcome to Future Food System. I'm here with Jeremy, a real architect, to talk about timber. And we are so excited because we're finally doing our first dinners, so you can go online and book tours and book dinners. They are booking up very fast, so I've already had on my way here a lot of phone calls saying, can I get in on that night? But it's so small. We've basically got a table of 6 and a table of 4 and then 2 twos, so it is booking up quickly. We've had a pretty big week because we've finally been able to do food, and I have to say that this has been my favourite moment of the whole last 6 months, watching Matt and Joe work out what to do, how to cook it, harvesting food, and it's delicious. And every day there's something new. We've got a loaf that's made from oats and buckwheat today, and what are you making, Joe?
I'm making risotto.
Risotto, yum. So one of the biggest reactions that we've had to the walkthroughs that Jeremy and I have done is about the timber. There's a lot of questions about why is FSC certified timber a no for me. And I'll just briefly explain Forest Stewardship Council timber, which is, I think it started in 1992. It was started with a whole bunch of members, including Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, and it was really created because people wanted to have certainty and confidence in knowing that timber would come from a responsible source. And sadly, what's happened over the last 5 to 10 years is that both Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund have left the organisation. And it's now heavily reliant on membership payments, and there's a lot of stuff going on. And there's a great website called FSC Watch, which has been highlighting for the last 10 years the many things that have gone wrong. But there's also Greta Thunberg's recent post about the industry in the timber industry in Sweden. Highlights some of the problems with it. But my biggest problem with it really is that ultimately I'm obsessed with nature, and I love the natural world, and I love forests, and especially wild biodiverse forests. So there's two problems and we're filling up the pool today, so which is pretty exciting. And what happens with wild forest is that you've got biodiversity. So you've got many different species, and you've got lots of wildlife, and you've got old trees with newer trees, and an old tree falls down, creates space for another. And when I've walked through monoculture forests, which is almost all FSC forests, they're planted, the trees are exactly the same, probably have the same parentage, they're exactly the same age, they're planted exactly the same distance apart, and they're planted purely for profit. And then there's the use of herbicides to wipe out any competition so the trees grow really fast. And the use, in Australia especially, they use a lot of bait to get rid of wildlife, to stop wildlife from eating young trees. I mean, I know that it's almost impossible to do this stuff without, something loses usually. But when you see it on that scale, and when you walk through a plantation monoculture forest, you never see any wildlife, you never see any birds, and I just don't believe it needs to be done that way. And then there's the other problem, which is a stamp called Controlled FSC, which has the same logo. So if you don't know, you just think, oh yeah, I'm buying FSC certified timber. Controlled FSC basically means that we have no idea where this timber's come from. And it's almost always from an old growth forest. It could be Borneo, it could be Peru, the Amazon, Russia, and it could be a tree that's 500 or 600 years old. We don't know. And it's happening on a massive scale, and one journalist has worked out that over 1 billion wild trees have gone since the start of the FSC certification process. And finally now these documentaries are coming out and making people aware, but sadly most of it doesn't even end up in buildings. It actually ends up as paper and takeaway packaging, and it's a great way for companies to hide the DNA or to hide where these trees come from, turning it into pulp, turning it into paper. And I think that's devastating. But we're here with Jeremy. We've talked a lot about this because
we've argued a lot about this.
Yeah, because I mean, I've tried to create a building here without FSC certified timber, and I know it was bloody hard, but I kind of feel that you've got to start somewhere, and I think that there's, you know, a way where everybody wins.
Yep.
So what do you think?
I feel like I've been set up.
No. You and I talk about this a lot, so let's just have this discussion now.
All right, cool. So, yeah, firstly, I'm not paid by FSC. I'm not on the board. You know, I care deeply about the planet, just like you, Joost. And I think that the best thing that we can do for the natural environment is to keep humans out of it. So I'm a big fan of sustainable urbanisation, as you know, and at Breathe Architecture, you know, we worked with a bunch of other Melbourne architects about 5 years ago to establish this thing called Nightingale Housing, which is all about sustainable urbanisation, and it's about trying to house 116,000 homeless people in the country, and it's also trying to house 45% of Australians now aged under the age of 35 who can't afford anymore to access housing in Melbourne and Sydney, in the capital cities, and how to get them into home ownership and not on a life of kind of, you know, rental insecurity. So that's the context of how I'm approaching this.
Yep.
So prior to 2015, I was so much like you. You know, it's like the first house that I did, you know, everything was recycled timber. You know, when I couldn't get the right price, I'd go and source everything myself, and I'd do it. You know, I literally, Tam and I laid the floor in the first house that we did together.
Yep.
You know, because we couldn't get the builder to agree to use, you know, second-hand floorboards. And what I want to talk about is scale, and this is the problem, right? And so I wholeheartedly admit that there are fundamental problems with FSC. But what I want to talk about is progress rather than perfection. And in 1990, I moved to Tasmania to study there for 6 years. And what I saw there was horrific. So I lived in Launceston, and every day I would see trucks rolling past with massive native eucalypts being driven up to the pulp mill to be turned into pulp, to be sent off to Japan, to be turned into toilet paper, right? To be sold back to us at a value add.
Yeah.
And then after seeing so much of, you know, this beautiful Tasmanian wild landscape being demolished, you know, just clear felled, what it was replaced with was usually like single species blue gum or pine, and monoculture, you know, waiting on, and horrific outcomes. At that time, there was no FSC or PEFC. And so the difference is FSC is international, and PEFC is the Australian kind of certification and the chain of custody process. And while I agree that a monoculture is horrific, I also think that you like anything, like if you think about our building code and how imperfect it is, that currently our building code, you know, all you need to build a house in Victoria is for it to be 6 stars. So you need to get 6 out of 10. If I got 6 out of 10 and I brought that back to my mum, she'd say, "That's terrible. You're in your room. You're going to study."
Yep.
But here, to build a house, you need 6 stars out of 10, and that's good enough. Congratulations. Here's your building permit. So a national construction code is terrible compared to the UK or America or New Zealand, but they're about to improve that, you know, with the updates to the National Construction Code, and everyone should encourage the National Construction Code to be more stringent on energy efficiency. And I guess what I'm saying is that pre-1990, there was no control over the way timber was used. Everyone would use whatever they want. They would buy Merbu and Meranti decking from the local hardware store. It would come from Southeast Asian countries and be totally uncontrolled. They'd be destroying entire, you know, villages and ecosystems. And I'm not saying that's not happening at the moment. But I guess what I'm saying is that with FSC, there is some system, some checks and balances, and a chain of custody for that product. And so the way that we specify timber at Breathe looks like this. So we've got like a specification list. 1, recycled timber. So if you go into any of the Nightingale buildings that have been completed by Breathe, they all have 100% recycled timber floorboards that have been reused.
Yeah.
Secondly, we try to go to Bowerbird, or we try to find a timber mill like you did to mill the macrocarpa.
Yeah.
And it's difficult, Joost, unless you're Joost and you know...
That's difficult anyway.
Yeah, it's difficult anyway. But that's difficult, right? So what you've done here is incredible, but it takes a lot of dedication to do that.
Yep.
And we struggle to do that at scale, whereas the, with the recycled timber flooring, we can go to Andy or Dave at Urban Salvage, or we can go to Timber and Rose. We can find a way to find that, and we can find a way to do that at scale. If we can't get recycled timber, and if we can't, find agroforestry logs and get that, the next step down for us is FSC, and FSC not from a Southeast Asian country, so not from a developing country. We prefer, as bizarre as it sounds, to get it from Sweden, where we trust that the Forest Stewardship Council there would be more rigorous in their work, and that there's not going to be the likelihood of risk there. And ideally it would be Australian. Obviously, the best thing if you get it from Australia. If we can't do that, the next step down in the tier is PEFC, so Australian sourced. If we can't do that, the next one down, you're going to hate this, is AFS. And we've had lots of people criticising us about the AFS standard. And so that's kind of our hierarchy, like our 5-step hierarchy for specifying timber. And then the other thing that we do is, you can imagine that we buy 100% post-consumer waste paper not that we use paper anymore in architecture, but importantly, it's about changing market demand, right? So when you buy Who Gives a Crap newspaper, toilet paper, you can now choose one that's post-consumer waste.
Yep.
And so that's the one that we choose. You can buy the safe toilet paper, which is 100% post-consumer waste.
Yeah.
So I think that it's really important that we all get to choose, what happens in the marketplace by our choices. So why the hell would we be mulching up new trees to make toilet paper or to make cardboard for TV boxes? And then...
there's a whole other alternative that should be used, which is straw. Yeah. But the problem with straw is it can never compete with wood chips, because wood chips, the Victorian government gets $1 a tonne.
Yeah.
So like a tonne
So it's free.
Well, you may as well not even charge people for it,
Whereas you've got to grow straw.
Well, for straw, it's a byproduct, it's a waste product, and farmers would love to sell it and probably almost give it away, but not at $1 a tonne. They need to get a tractor out, they need to use diesel, they need to bale it, they need to cut it.
There's work involved. You can't just rely on 100 years of culture.
So if we were happy with $5 a tonne or $20 a tonne, which if you look at like the cost price of a roll of toilet paper, $1 a tonne is like it's not even part of the cost. So we're not being realistic about that. But there was a paper mill in India, or there still is, it's huge. And that was set up by the government. And there's about 40,000 farmers that provide straw for this paper mill. And it used to be called Nature's Paper. You could get it from Officeworks, made from 100% straw. And they made toilet paper and really high quality copy paper, but they don't sell it in Australia anymore. But it's sad because because it's subsidised. The wood chips is subsidised. That's why it's being used. Without the subsidies, the paper companies would be looking at other alternatives.
So I feel like that there are a couple of easy steps. I think the other thing that's important. Let's come back and talk about paper in a minute. The other thing that's important for us when we specify timber is that we specify the right durability class for the right usage. So there's kind of 4 durability classes, in Australia. So there's, class 1, which can be 25 years outside in the ground. That's how long CSIRO have been testing it. But that's, like ironbark, the stuff that never ever rots. And there's class 2, like black butt, that you can have, above ground on a deck, but it can still be outside for 25 years without ever needing to be painted or rotted. And then there's class 3, which is like standard eucalypt, mixed hardwoods, messmate, which is great for floorboards. It's nice and hard, but it'll only last 7 years outside. And then there's class 4, which is radiata pine, which will only last 4 years outside before it starts to rot. And so for us, we're very careful about the way we specify timber. So at Breed, I know that Bonnie will only ever specify outside a class 1 or a class 2 timber, but inside she will never specify a class 1 or a class 2 timber. So for Bon, inside it's always a class 3 or a class 4 timber, because she doesn't want to use the resources of a timber that can last for 25 years outside without ever being oiled. She doesn't want to use that inside. And then it's the classic case of only use what you need, you know. So be thoughtful about, so you use DuraPanel in here, this isn't all made of timber. This is straw and cardboard, made from some smart crew in Bendigo. So I think that, be thoughtful about how you use the materials. And on a floor, it makes sense to put in floorboards, but, do you need it on your ceiling? Could you?
Well, I think so you've got quite a deep understanding of what's going on in the process. The problem that I have is that a lot of people don't. They don't really dig deep enough to try and find out what is going on. And I think that the more knowledge that's there, and the more people understand that if you choose a timber, that it could come from a rainforest, that,
Well, maybe, Joost, what we should be saying, firstly and foremostly, is that if you're going to buy toilet paper or paper product of anything, do not buy it with an FSC logo on it. Because that's trees that have been cut down and mulched to be turned into paper to wipe your ass. So I think that we all need to commit to buying 100% post-consumer waste for all of our paper, everything.
But here's I think we can get away from monoculture forestry as well, because the more that you understand it, you realise that you're not building a forest for wildlife, you're just building a forest purely for profit. I think you can have both. And the Americans are actually really good at it. They've been doing it for over 100 years, where privately owned locked up forests, where they plant, trees, and they don't just plant out 1,000 acres of oaks. They plant, in groups and along, they might have a paddock for cows, and then they'll have land locked up to one side for oaks, and then 10 years later they'll plant the other side. But we don't do that very well. We just go, right, let's just plant 10,000 acres of blue gums there, and then suddenly the ground is dry, no one can farm it because they suck up so much water. So I want to talk about the idea of planning and getting companies involved and getting governments involved in the idea of our farmers producing our timber, because they can. There's a great farm, actually I spoke to the Stewarts tonight on the way here, and they've got a farm called Yan Yan Gert Farm, which is in Deans Marsh, and about probably 30 years ago now, they started planting trees that were ultimately going to be cut down. So there's this 600-acre farm that was suffering with erosion and the sheep. There were not many trees and not much biodiversity, and they weren't making any money. And so they decided to start planting trees. They planted for biodiversity, so not just one species, but hundreds of different species. They planted every year. And what's happened in the last 5 years is every year they cut down 100 or so logs, and they're 35, 40 centimetre logs, high quality, because every year they go and lob the branches off and make sure that they're nice and straight. But they've also got trees in the understories. And so what they've got is protection for animals, shade for animals, trees for biodiversity, and some of those trees that they planted will never be cut down. So they'll plant, out of every 10, one will be there forever. And imagine if the 100,000+ farmers in Australia did that, got paid carbon credits to not only plant a tree, but look after a tree. And that, I believe, could be an amazing future. Each farm, on average, is 4,000 acres. So planting 10 trees is like nothing,
And this is called agroforestry, right?
Yeah. So there's so many benefits, because you're lowering the salt and you're stopping erosion. There's every farm, no matter which farm it is, has land that can't be used for whatever it is that they're doing. Either it's too steep, or it's got, water running through it, or whatever. So if we encourage farmers to start planting trees, so that in, 10, 15 years' time, and then planting things like sugar gum. So you've got this incredible timber.
Sugar gum, class 1.
Yeah.
Yeah, so great timber. Bonnie loves that.
It's indigenous to South Australia, but it's now grown throughout Victoria for windbreaks and shade for animals. But the beauty about it is you only have to ever plant it once. You cut it, coppice it, and it just regrows. So if you plant a sugar gum today, let's say around Ballarat is a good example. In 15 years' time, you can cut that tree. You'll get a 30 centimetre log, depending on the rainfall there. But then you'll be able to recut that same tree 10 years later because the root system's already developed. It's all there. And so the tree grows much faster. And so encouraging farmers to become our future wood suppliers, I think, could be great.
Yeah, so this idea of agroforestry, is both agriculture and forestry mixed together. And I guess we get the benefits of having, the short-term crop or herd that's living on the farm currently, but then also the trees that are planted, and when they mature in 20 years or 30 years' time, and Joost is right that if you're planting every year, then you have a rolling harvest, like this legacy crop. So it's the ability for farmers to get, what Joost is saying is two revenues, so one from the farm, one from the trees, but it's really a third as well, because obviously now with China, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, all committing to go carbon neutral, all of them committing to go carbon neutral by 2050, except China by 2060. But as that happens, carbon credits are going to become worth more and more and more. And so if you think about that as the third income stream for farmers, it's incredible. All we need now is the Australian government, Mr. Morrison, to commit to going carbon neutral by 2050, like everyone else. That's as mainstream as you get.
Well, it's inevitable, but I don't know when.
Yeah.
Here we go. We've got the first. So this pool is made in a 6-metre shipping container, and
hang on, check out the mullet on this kid. This is incredible.
Oh no, I need my phone. I was going to film this.
His hair was like a comet flying into the.
So, how do we design this? That's going to happen every night. A big bomb, for sure. Anyway, yeah. So, just on the pool idea came about in 2009 when the bushfires were really bad, and lots of people thought they had backup pumps and backup water, but because of the heat, the radiant heat before the fire got up to 100 degrees 45 minutes before the fire came, so pumps just melted and exploded, and and so I thought, well, what about if we could convert a shipping container into so that the pump sits below the body of water and is protected, and that's really what this is. So this design is open source. Tim Gibney, who's a brilliant engineer, has completely engineered it, so you can go with his drawings to any steel fabricator anywhere in the world. So can you fabricate this out of an old grain container? So grain containers are open top, so they don't have a roof on it. So if you have an interest in a natural pool, what we've got here is an EnviroSwim system, so there's no chemicals, uses electricity and copper to control algal blooms and that sort of thing. It's an Australian design, made in Brisbane, and you'll have a natural pool, 30,000 litres of water that you can access if there's a fire coming. And hopefully you'll never get to use it, but you'll get to use it every day in your pool. Yeah. So it's interesting to talk about this timber because I think that if you think about the amount of trees that have been cut down, part of this project is about creating an alternative food system, so that we don't need all that agricultural land to grow food, so we can start to actually replant billions of these trees that need to be replanted. And one thing that's been proven scientifically is that young trees, obviously when they're growing, absorb a lot of carbon. So it's not really about, I like the idea of not just planting all these trees to be cut down. Like if we plant 10 trees and 3 of them are actually for use, but the other ones are planted for wildlife, biodiversity, that sort of thing. So I want to try and get that discussion going, especially amongst architects, because you guys have such a powerful voice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, theoretically, historically. So architects need to specify carefully, obviously. The other thing that I wanted to say is that to all my fellow architects out there, in fact, to anyone that has a business, I think that it's critical, particularly at a time when our government hasn't declared a commitment to a carbon neutral pathway to 2050, that I think that each of us as individuals or corporate citizens need to make that decision. So last year, over 200 architects declared to go carbon neutral, and they went through a carbon audit process, and then they offset the rest of their carbon. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, have come out and said that the best possible way that you can spend money on your carbon credits is now on biodiversity. So historically, we've been told by engineers, don't buy carbon credits in trees, buy it in a wind turbine, or buy it in a solar plant.
farm or something. Yeah.
And what we're hearing now from the IPCC is exactly what you're hearing, which is that biodiversity loss and tree canopy loss and tree loss is a massive, massive issue in an accelerator of climate change. And so the best carbon credits that you can get is actually in replanting our forests and replanting our biodiversity. So architects, get out there, get your carbon audit underway. We did it at Bree that cost us like $1,600 for the first year, and our carbon credits cost us $1,500. And now we're carbon neutral. And believe it or not, it helps us secure work when we're working for the City of Melbourne or the City of Sydney, places that have declared a climate emergency, the City of Yarra, the City of Moreland, the City of Darebin. So, I mean, for us, we did it because we care about the environment, but strangely enough, of course, it actually helps you, be successful in business when you're dealing with other people that care.
Plus also, change has never come from government, ever.
I think that's totally true, Joost.
The point that
Depends on the government.
Well, I mean, it was actually Alan Savory that pointed that out when we hosted him here. He said, okay, there were some very, very smart people around the table, and we were talking about government, and he said, I'm sick of everybody talking about government. Name one government in the last 250 years that started a revolution. And we all sat there and went, well, we couldn't really. It started by people.
Hang on a minute. The American government,
the
US government.
As in, like if women voting or women, gay rights or anything like that. It starts with people, And once politicians realise, actually, we should really go this way because majority of the people feel this way. That's when change gets made by government, But I think it's also a little bit weak and soft to rely on a government to try and. Why don't you just change?
Yeah.
It's not that hard.
No, correct. And it's the usual story. Like I think that, we as citizens have a voice, and we as consumers have a voice. And so we get to make our decisions, like not buying FSC toilet paper, but buying 100% post-consumer waste. We get to affect market change through that. And it's the same way with our choices, how we get to affect, government policy and government positions. So, it would be great if the government can lead, but if not, let's just lead the government.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Lead by example.
Let's not wait. We can't afford to wait.
Well, I hope that that's actually given some insight into and answered some of the questions. I'm just trying to think if there was, another example. There's some, FSC Watch is a great website. There's Greta Thunberg just posted about a movie that's been made about the Swedish forestry industry, which is sadly cutting down wild forests still at a really alarming rate. That, like what?
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that we're specifying.
Well, I mean, this is exactly the point. That because they're so highly trusted, everyone just assumes, they're doing the right thing.
There's a lot of trust in the Swedes.
I know, and that's the same here. I mean, we still are cutting down wild forests at an alarming rate, and there's just no need for it. So. First, and that's another thing. That's another reason why I'm a big fan of using light gauge steel as an alternative to timber. Especially in termite zones. A very good friend of mine, Ward Pepperidge, has got waste converters in Dandenong, and he pulls his hair out with all the termite treated timber that's coming onto his site when he tries to recycle building waste, and it can't be recycled. It can only go to landfill. He's actually putting in an incineration plant, a waste to energy plant, which is really, not the greatest results. But if it was timber that wasn't termite treated, or if it was steel, it would just go back into another building material. So My number one thing, if you've got timber, use it where you can touch it and feel it, and use steel in a way that can be recycled. And also, when you design buildings that have heavy loads, like this building's got 30 tonne of soil on it, it's a bit problematic. Although my architect Tim Gibney is quite obsessed with timber, and he believes it could easily be done in timber. And every time we do a building, he goes, "Can we do the next one in timber?" But yeah, it is a lot easier to do buildings that are highly engineered like this and designed to take heavy loads in steel. And just while we finish up, I just wanted to say again, if you want to book a tour or you want to go come for dinner, go online and book both. You do need to book a tour because of the COVID restrictions and the amount of restrictions we have on people in this space. So we do need to have you book online, futurefoodsystem.com. Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks. See you, host.
See you in the forest.